All right, good afternoon, everyone. Um, Welcome to Emergency Prep 101 for Artists with Center for Cultural Innovation and CERF Plus. I'm Allison Wiper. I'm the Artist Knowledge Manager at CCI, Center for Cultural Innovation. We are a nonprofit service organization that was founded in 2001 to promote knowledge sharing, networking, and financial independence for individuals in the arts through business training, grants, and innovative projects that contribute to the realization of financial self-determination. You can visit us at cciarts.org for current grant opportunities such as the Quick Grant and Cali Catalyst, and learn about projects such as Ambitious, our national initiative to uplift solidarity economy efforts anchored by arts and culture communities and communities of color. Watch for upcoming workshops, including our signature Business of Art Bootcamp later this summer. And while I'm normally based in Tonga or Keachland in Echo Park, Los Angeles, today I'm calling in from Nevada City, California. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the Nisenan people on whose land I was born and am today, and the elders, both past and present, who have stewarded this land through the generations. And I would like to additionally acknowledge my own ancestors' role in the colonization of these and other traditional lands, and the lands that we are occupying through virtual space, and the ways in which these technologies we're using today are part of a continuing history of colonization. So at this time, I invite you to drop into chat where you're calling in from today. And if you're curious about the Indigenous history of your own town or city, you can go to native-land.ca and find out about that. I'll drop that into the chat for you all now. Just a note on accessibility before we get started. We've enabled automatic live transcription. So if you want to view that, you can click the CC button in your toolbar. We also will drop a link to today's slides as in a PDF form in the chat if you need to open that in a separate window. And we want to thank CERF Plus for partnering with us today to bring you Emergency Prep 101 for Artists, which will be a 90-minute webinar led by Carrie Cleveland. We at CCI have been fans of CERF Plus for a long time, and we recently worked with them on our latest Business of Art publication, which I will also link to in chat. Carrie, welcome, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Allison and CCI, for that warm welcome. The fandom is very much mutual, and we're huge fans over here at CERF Plus, and are so excited and grateful for this opportunity to talk about emergency preparedness today. I'm going to do the Zoom dance and share my screen. And so I am a longtime staff member at CERF Plus. Just a little background, I've been with the organization for over 14 years now, and I'm really lucky to have participated in all facets of our work to support artists in having resilient careers. My own background ranges from studying history and art with a focus on sculpture at Marlboro College to spending years as a musician. I've also been incorporating metalsmith work into my practice for the past several years as I'm able. And now I imagine under non-COVID times, the before times, we'd be gathered in person in a room with easels and pads of paper and markers and the chance to get to know each other. So I hope that you'll engage in this webinar with that spirit. And I'm really excited to talk to you about ways that you can take steps to shore up your own emergency resilience. I'm going to start out with an introduction to CERF Plus and our work to really help set the stage for why I'm here. And next, we're going to move into the meat of how to take on the concept of emergency preparedness and career resilience and get started with identifying priorities. And then I'll finish with some steps you can start taking now to shore up your creative practice against emergencies. And I'll note that there's a lot of content here. Don't feel like you have to capture everything at once. As Allison said, this is being recorded. Allison's also going to share some links throughout the webinar. I also have several colleagues from CERF Plus who are here today, who are also real aces on resources and knowledge, and might chime in the chat with some additional links. And we should have plenty of time for questions at the end. You can feel free to drop those questions into the chat while they're fresh in your head. Allison has very graciously offered to collect them, and then we can dive into some of those at the end. So with that, let's move into learning more about CERF Plus. So CERF Plus was founded in 1985 as a grassroots mutual aid organization by artists for artists. And we were founded through the inherent generosity of the craft community, and primarily artists who are at craft shows, who found that they were always passing the hat for a peer who had had a flood or a fire or an illness or an injury. And from that kind of analog crowdfunding beginning, we've grown into a national nonprofit serving the entire United States and territories. And we provide emergency relief to artists who work in craft disciplines such as ceramics, and wood, or metals, and fiber and glass. We've also grown throughout those years to support artists throughout all stages of their careers, in emergency or not. And we work on a national level to strengthen the safety net for artists. We really strive to be the go-to for studio-based artists on readiness, with information resources, and educational programs, and actionable information to help artists be emergency ready. And we also act as an advocate for the needs of artists, working with both the general emergency management community and the federal government to ensure that their programs include artists and other self-employed workers. And so if you're wondering about that CERF in our name, it comes from that founding mission, the Craft Emergency Relief Fund. And what that is it's financial assistance, providing emergency relief grants of $3,000 to arts and craft disciplines across the United States and territories who have experienced a career-threatening or serious emergency. And while we know that $3,000 might not be enough to make someone whole after emergency, we aim to act quickly so that that money can bridge the gap between, say, the emergency and an insurance payment or disaster relief. And the criteria is, as it implies, being an artist working in a craft discipline who's experienced a career-threatening emergency. We're not membership-based. We don't require any prior relationship with CERF Plus. And when we talk about emergencies, of course, those are the ones you hear about on the news, like the big fires, the floods, the hurricanes, the earthquakes, the tornadoes. But those can also be the very personal emergencies too, like the illnesses, the injuries, the thefts, the things that the emergencies that don't make the news. Then the other facet of our emergency relief program is our In Kindness program, where we work to broker donations for the artists we've assisted from suppliers. For example, there is a wonderful kiln manufacturer who's able to donate kilns periodically, or some other suppliers who are able to donate materials, or say a show producer who can donate space at, say, a craft show for an artist who's working to recover. Just that ethic of trying to deepen the assistance and helping an artist really get back to their career after a career-threatening setback. And then from there, we kind of moved into career protection, and Hurricane Katrina was kind of a catalyst for CERF Plus, where we realized that in addition to supporting artists after emergencies, we really needed to do more work to support artists before those emergencies even happened, to shore up that resilience, knowing that while we can't stop the hurricane, can't stop the fire, can't stop the flood, we can support artists in having information and tools and resources to mitigate the losses that might come with those emergencies so they can get back to their practice as quickly as possible. And that's taken a couple different forms. It continues to develop throughout CERF Plus's work. The initial impetus was, and manifestation, was our Studio Protector. And this is a tool that really supports artists throughout their practice, whether it's way before an emergency and kind of setting principles, some of the things we'll be talking about today, to an emergency is coming, what steps should you be taking, to the emergency has happened, how can you rebuild and recover? We have an insurance hub on our site that goes into the details of accessing insurance for a creative practice. And don't worry, we will be talking a lot about insurance later in this webinar, and they'll give you lots of details and tools on how to start to access insurance or deepen your coverage for your practice. We have our Crafting Your Legacy workbook, which looks at your creative legacy as an artist and going beyond the tools of or the artwork of your practice, but looking at your studio contents, the tools, the unique practices that go into making your work, and taking agency now to really set your own legacy as an artist. Our Cover Your A's program works with art school faculty to help them embed emergency preparedness curricula in their work with students, so the next generation of artists start their careers with emergency preparedness and career protection right at the forefront of their practice. Our studio safety guide walks through the various levels of what to look at in a studio to make sure that its setup suits your practice and you can conduct your practice safely. It's not the granular, like how to use a skill saw safely, but really kind of looking at a space to see whether or not it's meeting your needs and supporting you in having a safe practice. We partnered with the organization Wellness for Makers to put together a series of videos on self-care and your studio practice. So for example, there's a video on if your work in your practice involves like kind of bending over, the framing is working with an artist who works at a loom, but you do work that taxes your back, your spine, how to care for yourself because you are your most valuable asset as an artist, and really support yourself and your physical person in making your work. And then lastly, our Get Ready grant program puts dollars behind the actions of preparedness. It provides grants of up to $500 to take some kind of emergency preparedness or career protection measure. This can mean investing in safer equipment for a studio practice. It can involve getting legal counsel to support your practice. We've also added a COVID resilience lens, knowing that emergency preparedness and career protection has really changed with the nature of the pandemic. So if you are needing to further develop your online practice, for example, to support your career resilience and need better photographs of your artwork, the Get Ready grants can support that. And I'll note that the next cycle of Get Ready grants is launching next Wednesday, June 15th. And so let's start talking about career protection and emergency preparedness, because with the kind of framework of how we've approached that work, what we're really trying to do is support artists in being ready and being resilient. And so here are just some grounding definitions to hold as we move through this webinar. What is being ready? It's being in a suitable state for an activity, action, or situation, being fully prepared. And then when we talk about resilience, it's the power or ability to return to the original state, or if that original state is no longer accessible and things have changed, the ability to recover or adjust easily to adversity or change or new situations. And so then what does being ready and resilient look like in the context of being an artist? And so what we're talking about from that lens, it's answering this question: how can you prepare your business, career, and artistic practice to recover after an emergency? What can you do ahead of time to mitigate and minimize losses? And so here are some big picture themes of what it looks like to be ready and resilient, have that more sustainable practice. It looks like incorporating that readiness right deeply embedded into your artistic practice. It's not kind of some conceptual thing that lives outside. It's folded in, it's interwoven into what you do. It's increasing your awareness of unsafe conditions and how to avoid them. So knowing how to spot what might be that tension point in your practice, what might be that thing that's going to cause something to go boom down the road, and knowing how to kind of head it off at the pass. It's knowing how to access resources, knowing what's out there. So once you know what you need to do, knowing where to go, to how to find the information and the supports that'll really help you take the steps to shore up that emergency resilience and preparedness. It's developing and maintaining a network. And it's that notion of, you don't have to do this alone. I know that so much of the artistic practice, it's kind of you making your work very kind of one-on-one, just you and the materials. But when I think about emergency preparedness and that ethic, just it's in our name, the artist safety net, it is a network, it is a community. And knowing that you don't have to do this by yourself, and there are people that you can engage with and support you in building your own resilience. And then lastly, practicing self-care, because again, you are the most important part of your practice. And so just having that care for yourself is just the core kind of key piece of being ready and resilient as an artist. And this picture I've included here, I love this. This is from an artist named Lee Shuggs, who got a Get Ready grant several years ago. And one of the things that Lee recognized as kind of a vulnerability in her work is that she does these very, very intricate cut paper pieces, highly detailed. I encourage you to look up her work. It's incredible. And she realized that the way she was storing it in her studio was leaving it really vulnerable to damage. So she built a set of custom racks in her studio space. But what I love about her project is that she didn't just build enough space for her. Her studio was in one of those big, like multi-use studio spaces. And so she incorporated additional space in that racking system so that other artists in her building could also take advantage of that rack to store their work more safely too. And that really speaks to that notion of like a supportive network. And so when you're thinking about this, the information I'll be talking about, think about how you can kind of work with other artists to share what you've learned, also support each other, where someone might have abilities, strengths, material skills to support what you're doing and where you might be able to offer the same for them. So the first step in getting started and really taking this on for yourself and figuring out what this all means for you, what it looks like, is to figure out what are your risks and kind of stepping back broadly and thinking about them. And I know that thinking about risks after we've just spent 2 years of thinking about risks, looking for risks, it can feel a little challenging, a little conflating, but really this is a chance to think holistically about your career and your practice as an artist and identify what assets are critical to your artistic career and what can you least afford to lose. What's most important to you in your artistic practice. And then lastly, how would an emergency impact your assets and cause potential losses? And there's a really clear, simple way to start answering those questions and building out a framework to address that for yourself. This is where I encourage you to grab a pen or a piece of paper because we're going to run through an exercise together. So we're going to get started on a risk assessment. And the key word is start. So think of a risk assessment as a tool that helps you build your personal resilience action plan. And this risk assessment is a living document that you can continue to build and work on throughout your practice as things change, your situation changes, new things come up. And so what is a risk assessment? It's the process of thinking through the property, the events, the people that are instrumental to your career and the types of hazards that you might face based on your unique circumstances, your particular location, your particular art form, the kind of practices that fold into your career. And the reason that running through an exercise like a risk assessment is important is this really identifies the potential risks that you might face so you can take action to protect against them, minimize potential losses, and lessen the recovery time that keeps you from getting back to your practice in a way that's really specific to you and your practice. So if everyone's ready, let's dive in. So the first step is to think through what your assets are as an artist and in your practice. And asset is really broad here. It's a useful person or thing or value or even a quality. I encourage you to start writing down what some of these might mean for you. And so structures, that could be obviously a studio space or classroom space. Thing, and I know that thing is a little bit of a reductive term, but what I'm getting at here is like the tangible objects of your practice. Obviously, like the artwork itself, if you are making physical pieces, this could be tools or equipment that you use to make your work. It could be technology that you rely on. And then people and relationships, again, I'm going to constantly harp on this, like you are the most important person in your practice, but also do you use assistance within a studio space? Think about your customers or clients, galleries or other producers or sellers, show producers, et cetera, that you might work with, or students, events. This could be classes, performances, shows, exhibitions. So I'm going to pause for a second and let you kind of think through some of these things, make some notes for yourself. I really encourage you to drop anything that's coming to you in the chat and share out with others. That whole community notion, again, too, something you say might spark a reminder of someone else, or you might pick up on something else that someone else is saying. So lean into the opportunity to share with each other and start kind of thinking through this as a group. Yeah, what are your assets in your practice? And I'll pause for a moment. A reminder, you don't have to think of everything now. And for those of you who are watching this later on the recording, feel free to take advantage of the luxury of being able to pause and really do this like a longer form process. Those of you who are here with us today, again, living document, living practice. You don't have to think of everything right now, but just take some notes, start thinking through maybe at that highest top level. What are your assets as an artist? What's most important to your practice? Give another moment.
And Carrie, Holly is asking, what are events? Can you explain what events are in this context?
Yeah, so events, thinking about, so if you are someone who, if you're a ceramic artist and you're primarily conducting your practice through like craft shows, so those type of events, especially if there are specific ones that you tend to do and are really reliant on them happening, or if you teach regularly and there are specific kind of classes, so kind of beyond like, clients, if you're selling one-to-one, or the actual objects in your practice, or the studio space, are there like happenings that you can rely on, or that are interwoven into how you conduct your practice? Again, can keep building this out later, but I'm going to move on. So the next step is to think through the hazards or kind of emergencies that could apply to you and your artistic practice. And these are just some samples, but add in any that could affect you, remembering that not all emergencies are natural disasters like floods or fires, but they're also the floods and fires that aren't like major natural disaster, reliant. Or maybe think through the ways that you make your work, like maybe based on the materials that you use, there are chemical hazards that are a vulnerability to you, or maybe based on the materials you use or the location, theft is a hazard for you. Or going back to the tenet of self-care again, the way that you physically make your work carries a kind of vulnerability for you. And as you think through these, this is not like a doomsday exercise. Like you don't have to think through like every possible bad thing that could happen. Think through like the likelihood of events. While some hazards can't necessarily be predicted. I mean, several years ago, would any of us have predicted the pandemic? There are other hazards that have a rhythm and a frequency. So what are the ones that kind of rise to the top as the most likely for you? And as you're thinking through hazards, kind of like think through like what the actual thing that brings the damage to you is, are. Like, for example, like water events, like water in a studio, if that's a vulnerability to you, like what does that bring? Water brings like damage to materials. It brings like mold. Mold is like the vulnerability. Kind of like think through kind of down to like what's the actual thing that causes the harm, if that makes sense. And so finally, the last step kind of putting like the A plus B into the C. You've identified your assets, you've identified the emergencies or hazards that you could affect your practice. Then when you put those together, kind of write out the impact and what those would have on your artistic practice. How would the assets that you brainstormed earlier be affected by the natural disasters that you identified as well? So again, like just kind of working from examples we kind of touched earlier, if you work in like paper and you've identified that flooding is a vulnerability to you, obviously like your work is going to be very huge, like severely impacted by a flood event. So that's the thing you want to think about. So okay, I've got to address the ways that I store my work. Like that's going to be the priority. And so kind of putting together that A, the assets, plus the B, the various hazards equals C, like here's what my particular vulnerabilities are based on my particular work and my particular circumstances around emergency. Like what are the possible scenarios that you might face? So just kind of take a step and write through what some of those kind of like the A plus B equals C moments are. Yeah, and again, I invite anyone who's coming up with some things they want to share, you can always drop them in the chat. Whether there's something that's occurred to you as an asset that's kind of surprising to you, or an emergency, or that impact piece, they're like, oh, like that's something I might want to take on. And again, don't have to be exhaustive right now. Don't have to think of everything. Definitely do not want this to be, a point of like, oh, that's a lot. Just start thinking through some of the things that you might want to start to work on, chip away at in your practice. And also, as you kind of keep doing this, I know this could be a point of overwhelm, so prioritize too. And so what we have here is kind of a graph where, on the vertical side, you're looking at that likelihood piece that I mentioned earlier for the particular hazards, unlikely being kind of lowest, medium likely to very likely as the highest. And then, horizontally kind of looking at the impact. So, you're identifying the impacts on your practice, but how serious of an impact would it have? Kind of a low impact, medium, or really high. And the pieces that rise to the surface of likelihood's really high, the impact would be really high, really huge. That's like, those are the ones you want to prioritize as things you're going to want to take on first in kind of like addressing your risks and starting to mitigate potential losses. So again, knowing that you can't fix everything all at once, think through the things that you really want to take on first, and that rise to the top to you as like, this is something I want to start addressing. And so from here, we're going to start getting into some of the steps that you can take, start addressing risks. There are some very easy things that you can start doing now that are free or have very low cost barriers. But again, keep thinking about this risk assessment exercise and building it out. Things will come to you later, fold them in. So I'm going to start off by talking about documentation. Documentation can exist in lots of different formats, be in lots of different things. And I come into this saying that I'm a little bit of a documentation nerd. I'm talking about both the kind of what of documentation and also the how. For example, do you have records of the contents of your studio or other places where you house objects related to your work? Or do you have images that you've been storing, whether they're records of sales or exhibitions or other documentation of your career that might live in a mixture of the cloud, hard copy, or like old external hard drives or thumb drives? Do you have really vital images or documents that only live in one fragile format, say like only in hard copy? Now is a really great time to create backups of documents and any records that are really, and it's really easy to take this on. It's really approachable to start building up kind of your own system of backing up your work. And I think a lot about the COVID era that we've just come out of, and all of the grant funding that was suddenly available, and the federal funding, and just that importance of having kind of records of your career at your fingertips to access some of those funds. And I think that's going to keep being the case going forward too, with more funding being available, hopefully, and just being able to quickly access that. And then I think about emergencies that are like the pandemic, the kind of complete opposite, where they're like very physical, real time, and you have to leave your studio, for example. What would you lose access to? What provisions could you put in place now? Are there key contacts for your artistic practice that you would have access to if you suddenly had to evacuate? And are there records that you wouldn't be able to access? I think too, when I was starting out at CERF Plus and kind of wrapping my head around the importance of documentation as an emergency preparedness measure. I remember an artist that we work with. She worked in ceramics. She had a really well-established career, and throughout that career, she'd been developing a suite of glaze formulas, and she kept that suite of formulas in a binder in her studio, and only in a binder in her studio. And the area that her studio was in flooded, and that binder of formulas washed away. I don't say that to scare anyone, but more that I think we all have, like, metaphorically, that suite of glaze formulas. We all have that thing that's really vital to our practice, that we really like, that kind of principle of like we could least afford to lose. And so thinking about documentation from that kind of background philosophy too, like what do we need to look at? What do we need to back up to shore up our own emergency resilience? So let's talk a little bit about some things to back up or some things to create to kind of either build out documentation across different formats, or to start to actually add documentation practices into your artistic practice. So, things to think about, having accessible in multiple formats, any contracts or invoices relevant to your practice, having access to your insurance policies in multiple formats, copies of your taxes. I think too about some of those federal loans, and just having like really strong records of your practice. Any consignments or gallery agreements, copies of your will, copies of your sales and portfolio. Again, contact lists that you might need, copies of your resume or CV, and inventory. And when I think about inventory, not just your artwork, but also the contents of your studio. And what else? What else is really important for you to be able to access in multiple ways under multiple scenarios? And I'm going to spend a little time kind of talking about inventory, because when we get to insurance later, having a really solid inventory around your practice is really crucial in being able to know what you need to cover, and also kind of knowing what you can't afford to lose. So let's talk about some methods to kind of approach inventory, some ways to get started. So I have some kind of snapshots of different methods here that you can use to approach taking on inventory of your studio. Because in addition, of course, like to your artwork in that first image, just having records of the actual contents of your studio, especially if you have tools that are really important to your practice. So you could do things that are as simple as taking a picture of studio contents just to start having some records. You could graduate from there to working in some kind of either database, like the top middle image, or just even an Excel spreadsheet, like in the bottom right, to start building out lists of what you have, trying to know its value. There are simple ways you could be adding records to the cloud. You could take video kind of narrations of the various contents of your work and storing those to multiple formats, and that kind of gets to the cloud, the external hard drive. And as you're starting to do some more inventory, including that relevant information, if it's your work, including things like obviously title and dimensions, medium, price. If you're starting to do some inventorying of the actual equipment that you use, considering things like make and model and description. If you are able to, approximate year you purchased it and at what cost, approximate replacement value, and some of those pieces of information like the replacement value. Don't worry, it's not information you have to know. You can look it up, but noting the condition as well of equipment. And just some additional notes on some of these. If you are using your smartphone to start documenting your work, it's a really great, simple way to start. Just taking photos around your studio. It's really easy to upload those then to, say, a Google Drive where you have records, or do that video upload to where you're kind of narrating information as you go. And some considerations, if you do use your smartphone to start building out inventory as you're shoring up your documentation and narrating the video, again, just some of the pieces of information to consider and including as you're starting to build up this collection of documentation and inventory. Again, we have this information on our website and in the Studio Protector. You don't need to remember this now, but do want to kind of make the point that when you're doing these kinds of record keeping, including as much as you can as relevant for the work that you're trying to document and inventory. Moving on from kind of a beginning work on using your phone or video to start building up some documentation, using spreadsheets. I know everyone's favorite, everyone loves a spreadsheet, but when you're ready to take kind of that next step, this is a great way to go. And CERF Plus actually has a suite of ready to go inventory and documentation spreadsheets on our website. You can download for free. You can, if you want to do it that way, and at least start with a copy on your computer. They're based in a Google Drive, so you can make a copy and then have an online record as well. And we have a suite of 4, as you can see from the 4 different little screenshots here. We have one for your art inventory that you can use maybe in conjunction with some photos that you've taken. We have an equipment inventory spreadsheet that you can use. And again, like if you start out with videos of your inventory, you can add those links in here. And, so you're never having to start over. You can just incorporate what you start with into where you go forward. And then we also have suites of spreadsheets for both sales and consignments as well. So when you want to start kind of taking that like more in-depth step, we have some tools ready to go for you. Like you don't have to start from zero. You don't have to invent the inventory wheel. And then there are some systems that do kind of inventory and documentation that you can purchase ready to go, and just some considerations for those. If you're thinking about going that direction, it's sort of a next step. Obviously, like, does it work for you? Does it meet your needs? Is it customizable? Are you going to get what you need out of it? And then how it's put together, its design, execution. Is it easy to use for you? Is it intuitive? Does it feel comfortable, or is it going to be a slog? What kind of support does it come with? Also thinking through like longevity of the company, how long have they been in business? Like, what are their reviews? Are they reputable? Are other artists happy with them? Are they a company that can support past versions, or are they like constantly going to be upgrading and asking you to like pay and add-on costs, those kind of like secret hidden, like, oh, this is great, now it costs me more. when you start using it, is it really easy to import data from another application or system? If you have been working on your own kind of self-generated inventory, is there a simple way to get your information into this system? And then the converse side as well, if you discover after using a kind of suite of like prepackaged inventory software, but you kind of outgrow it, or for whatever reason, it no longer works for you, is it easy to export your data in some standard format so you can change to a different program? And then, of course, the consideration of cost. Inventory systems can be fairly inexpensive. I think it's around $50 for like some of the light versions of things like Artwork Archive or Art Tracker. There are much more kind of robust, but conversely expensive ones like ArtStax. I think it runs up to about $1,000. And I'll note that a lot of these prepackaged systems are really around the work itself and less the studio contents. One of the exceptions, I think, GIST can get into like artist supplies. That's just GYST. And then just, in any kind of working through cloud-based systems, just a reminder of some of the advantages and disadvantages. Some of these are obvious, but it's always good to kind of remind yourself, advantages, always backed up, at least in theory, though it's good to have offline backups too. Multiplicity is your friend in emergency preparedness. You aren't location-based in terms of access as long as you have an internet connection. And typically you don't need to worry about software upgrading. It handles it on its own. And then disadvantages, you are internet reliant. I think about that mostly in emergency scenarios that require evacuation and issues around connectivity. And then just also keeping in mind that if a company suddenly folds, potentially losing access to your data. So having exports, having backups. And just some good principles around kind of any documentation practice, safeguarding really important key pieces of information. Whatever system you're using, backing up frequently, and kind of multiplicity again. And if there are things that you need for whatever reason to have in a hard copy, don't just have one or in one specific location. If there's something that really needs to live in hard copy, have it also in what we call a safe offsite location. If you have a friend who lives, say, about 50 to 100 miles away from your studio, see if they can hold a copy for you. And in case I wasn't repeating myself enough, multiple systems in case one fails, it's your best bet. All right, I know a couple of you were waiting for this, so now it is time for insurance. I know it's not everyone's favorite topic, but it makes such a huge difference. And it's also one of those real practical applications of having great documentation, of having great inventory. So I want to start with just a couple key notes. If you take nothing else from the section on insurance, I really just want to drive home the point that most homeowners policies don't provide coverage through business property. And what I mean by that is typically homeowners or renters insurance usually excludes most business property and all liability related to any business activities unless you have specifically purchased a home business endorsement or what's known as a rider. Homeowners insurance excludes buildings on your property if they're used for business purposes. And from an insurer's perspective, you're in business if you offer goods or services for sale. And then another thing I really want to note is that homeowners insurance, renters insurance, and business insurance policies typically exclude losses from floods and earthquakes. Those are separate policies and coverage that you need to acquire. They're not folded in. I am sensitive to the fact that insurance is an additional financial cost, but I at least, if you're thinking about it, want to give you some tips and information to help you move forward when you're ready about accessing business insurance. We've just seen through our emergency relief work that it makes such a huge difference. So I'm going to start off with the types of insurance to consider. And then the first is, business property coverage. I think of this as kind of the what of insurance. So business property, that covers the physical structure of your studio. Say if your studio is in a building too that's the same property as your home, just again, don't assume that homeowners insurance covers it. And then business personal property. This covers the contents of your studio. So this is the tools, this is the equipment, raw materials, works in progress, finished products, etc. So inland marine, again, a little kind of nerdy background information. It seems like a really unart related term. Inland marine comes from the shipping notion. Then it's the coverage from when things would leave a ship and start to travel over land. And the way that this applies to an artist's practice is this covers your work and other property when it's in transit or away from your studio. So this is the insurance that covers your work you're teaching or doing an installation or at an arts festival. And then the personal property of others. So if you do repair or conservation work, this is the coverage for work in your care. I will note, this doesn't cover you if you cause damage to the work while it's in your care, but rather that something happens to your studio and someone's work is in your care in your studio when that happens. This is the coverage that would cover you for that. So the next piece to consider is the liability. So if the business property, it's kind of the what coverage, this is more of like the who coverage. So there's general liability, and this is the insurance that protects you if someone is injured while they're on your property, or if your property causes damage to others. And liability insurance typically stays with you when you're at a location other than your studio. Then product and operations liability. And this is the coverage that you need in the event that someone is injured by one of your products or while you're performing your work somewhere. Then errors and omissions. This is a really important one if teaching is part of your practice. So if you write or teach, this is the coverage that you'd want in place in case someone is injured from following your advice or because of an instruction that you've omitted. And then the last is umbrella liability. And that's the coverage that protects you beyond kind of general liability and kicks in when all other liability coverage has been exhausted. And it's usually in increments of $1 million. And so lastly, on types of insurance, I'll just share some kind of other additional coverage that might be relevant to you depending on your circumstances. And again, those first two, flood insurance and earthquake insurance, they're typically not folded into general business plan or a policy either, just for homeowners or renters. It's a reminder there. And then the extra expense coverage, the next one, this is a coverage that can pay for relocation of your studio if necessary due to a significant loss. Employee dishonesty, it's pretty much as the name implies, that's the coverage for losses due to dishonest acts of employees. Workers' comp, if you do have paid employees as part of your practice, paid studio assistants, et cetera. It covers the medical costs and lost wages for a worker that's injured on the job. So some states require all businesses with employees to have this coverage. There are some that allow exemptions based on the size of the business and number of employees. However, if you don't have coverage, you're personally liable for those costs which can be for a long term, depending on the severity of the injury for that worker. And then last one I want to touch on, because I don't think it's well known, is commercial auto coverage. If you're using your personal vehicle as part of your business, think about having coverage for your vehicle as well. Because most often, if there's damage to your vehicle based on you kind of conducting your practice, your general kind of personal auto insurance wouldn't cover it. And then also think about, again, if you have people who kind of work for you as part of your practice and they're using their own vehicles for tasks that are connected back to your business and your practice, you would need coverage for what are then considered non-owned vehicles. I apologize for how technical this sounds. Just it's good to have that vocabulary in place. But if you do have, again, like studio assistant, et cetera, and they're using their own vehicle, they have an accident while doing work for you, their insurance may not pay. You could be held liable for that damage. And so, okay, I hope that didn't sound daunting. If it did, the good news is there are some really simple ways to get prepared to go talk to an insurance provider and feel like you're going in kind of armed with what you need to know. Just a reminder, first off, your inventory is your friend. Knowing what you need to have covered, knowing what your assets are, that puts you in a really good stead to talk to an insurance agent and kind of further build that out. You can prepare what's called a business commentary. This is really simple. It's just a 1 to 2 page description of your background, your experience, kind of the size and scope of your operations as an artist. And in this, be really honest and straightforward about your artistic practice, because then the insurance agent that you're talking to will use this information to weed out any kind of plans or policies that wouldn't work well for your practice. Really encourage you to shop around and get several quotes. Look for agencies that specialize in commercial lines, just because an agency sells auto or life insurance doesn't mean they're experienced in business insurance or even sell it. Really encourage you to ask friends or colleagues who they use, whether or not they've been happy with them. Ask questions, just because your representative understands your insurance needs and helps you design a package, or rather just be sure that they kind of understand your needs and help you design a package that works for you, appropriate to your situation. Really understand the size and scope of your coverage. Are there gaps in it? Are there kind of any exclusions? Again, like that notion that flood and earthquake coverage isn't typically folded in, kind of knowing where the holes might be. If there are pieces, based on your risk assessment that you're really, really concerned with, ask specific questions, ask where in the policy that risk is addressed. Make sure you're really clear with them on the deductible and how that relates to your coverage, to understanding what you might be on the hook for out of pocket. And then ask them about the claims process, and ask them kind of if there have ever been any claims made on the type of insurance that they're offering to you. And if so, what was the turnaround time? How long might you have to be waiting before you see a payout? And if no claims have ever been made, or you feel like the service is unreasonable, choose a different company to work with. And that sort of speaks to the last piece, which is really trust your gut. If you're asking a lot of questions and feeling like they're not getting fully answered, you're kind of getting the runaround, you're buying insurance for you, not for them. Make sure you feel comfortable with the agent that you're working with. Make sure you feel heard. Make sure you feel like the questions that you have have really been listened to, and they're offering in response, hey, here's how that coverage works for you. And if you don't feel that, walk away, find someone else. It's kind of not There's no point in having an insurance policy if you always have in the back of your head, like, what is this really gonna cover me? Like, find the one that works for you. Like, have insurance, but don't take the wrong policy. Take the one that actually makes you feel like your practice as an artist is being supported. And then we have some additional resources. Again, you don't have to remember all of this. On the left-hand side, see the graphic of our business insurance guidebook for artists, which has more information on both types of policies to acquire, things you can do to help prepare, to talk to an agent, and more questions you can ask. We have an insurance hub, again, on our website. I mentioned this at the beginning of the webinar. In addition to information, we have listings of insurance providers who are used to working with artists, who have plans that are tailored to artists, who know that an individual ceramics artist doesn't need a policy that's ultimately crafted for a large-scale ceramics manufacturer. That they have policies that understand you as an artist. And then we have a sheet on understanding the National Flood Insurance Program and what that covers, how to access it, things to consider. So visit the Insurance Hub. It also has some kind of frequently asked questions and just more information to help you go deeper when you're ready to start finding a plan that works for you. And moving on from insurance, thinking about emergencies, we're all familiar with, the idea of a go bag for an emergency, that kit that has a flashlight, your extra batteries, tools, extra money, pet food, etc. But what's your go bag for your artistic practice? And, it's not apples to apples here. I know that there might be some things you would want to take with you in an emergency, but you need them in everyday life and your everyday artistic practice. So you can't have them just stored away in a bag and ready to go in the same way you could that flashlight or set of batteries. But could you have a list ready of like critical, easy to transport things that you would want to prioritize gathering if you needed to evacuate? Say like your top 10 most important items, because some of emergency preparedness is also just thinking through now the things you might not have the mental energy to think through, or just the mental availability to think through when an emergency like a natural disaster is on the horizon. And so again, this is a chance to reference your inventory. It's a chance to reference your risk assessment and think through things that, kind of like, again, what's really key, like what would you want to gather quickly? Then you can also think about like, would I be able to gather them quickly? And think about, what's your, emergency grab and go bag for your career, for your artistic practice. And also in kind of addressing risks now, CERF Plus does have a studio safety guide. And again, this kind of looks through like the building itself, the structure that you're working in, the electrical setup that might relate to equipment that you use, ways that hazardous materials in your practice are used, or maybe others, the physical structure of the building in terms of like the heating and cooling system, and then also basic safety equipment that you might want to have in place. And just some examples to think about. And you can download the studio safety guide from our website. We also have a studio safety poster, which has some of the similar information. I'm calling out some of the key points that we talk about in studio safety you might want to think about, but I encourage you to download copies and look more. But thinking about things like, say if you're working in like a big multi-use building, are your art supplies allowed in that building or studio? And then I think a lot about all of those old factory buildings that have been converted into artist spaces. So was the building in that kind of conversion, was it designed as an artist space? And also, what was that building before? Was it something else that might prevent or present a health hazard? And also kind of thinking through that multi-use space. What are the other occupants in the building doing? Are they being safe? Are they doing things that might cause a vulnerability for you? I think about someone who we helped where someone was using water really irresponsibility in the space above their studio and slowly like seep through the roof and then eventually collapsed into their studio. So just kind of having an awareness about what other people in your space are doing and how that might impact you. And also beyond kind of like the water hazards, thing like that, are other people in the building using hazardous materials? Are they doing it safely? Are they storing things in a way that's going to present or could prevent or present a problem for you? Or think about people like and how they store like oily rags. Is that all being done safely? It's kind of knowing where some vulnerabilities might be creeping up based on the space you're in and other people using that space. And then for you, if you are using chemicals in your practice, do you have safety data sheets for those materials? Those are really easy to download online and get the safe handling information that you need for the materials that you have. Also, if you work with other people, making sure they have access to that information. And then lastly, having a plan, thinking about some of those big buildings that are kind of maze-like and warrens. Are there plans posted with routes for how to leave a building or a space in the event of an emergency? And so really this is getting at making sure that whatever space you're using, whether it's your own individual space, not connected to others or part of a group space, you're able to safely make your art, that the actual structure of where you're making your art, the location, the space, its kind of own setup isn't going to impact you, isn't creating a vulnerability unnecessarily. And then lastly, I'm talk a little bit about some other preparedness and recovery resources. I mentioned at the beginning, CERF Plus's Studio Protector. This is a really in-depth resource that I encourage you to spend some time with after this webinar, because it does walk through that risk assessment. If you want some more information there, we have more information on documentation, both the what to think about, how, so that can help you shore up any practices you want to build or kind of deepen, give you some more tools, give you some more information. You can get to our insurance hub through the Studio Protector. You can access actually a lot of the resources I mentioned earlier. If you are in a position where you need to get help after an emergency or you need to rebuild, there's a lot of information on, say, like salvaging safely after an emergency, the considerations around knowing whether or not you can re-enter a studio space after an emergency and do it in a way that's not going to harm you, what to look for, safety signs, and then also really too like granular. This is where we do get kind of granular. What kind of equipment you might want to have down to like the tarps, the gloves, like the things that you might not have the mental energy to kind of figure out on your own. We have that in place so that you don't have to. There are also stories from other artists who've been through emergencies with kind of what they learned, what was hard, some tips for others. I think of an artist who went through Hurricane Irene here in Vermont 11 years ago. And I got to meet him. He had an open house. He called it an open house, but what it really was about a couple weeks after his home and studio flooded during Hurricane Irene. He basically just had an open call for volunteers. And it was remarkable. He just had that knack for people just would show up in his yard and he could say, all right, I want you to go out to the barn and start scrubbing down this equipment that we've pulled out of the house. Like I want you in the basement mucking out like the clay that got really sodden. But that's not a natural skill set for everyone, especially like if you're like after, it's been an emergency, it's been in your own studio, and like maybe it's a studio in your home, like it's very, very personal and emotionally impactful. And so we have some tips from people like Jeremy who've been through that experience and know kind of how to like direct traffic in that situation. to help you kind of figure it out so that you don't have to, if like your energy is really being pulled in another direction. Again, like that whole notion of there is a huge network of resources and people who can support you in emergencies, both before and after. And then another facet of our Studio Protector that I want to call out, kind of going back to the step in the risk assessment when you were thinking about the particular hazards that might impact you. If there were specific ones around natural disasters in particular, we have a lot of resources around specific natural disasters. We have separate pages around how to protect your art studio from hurricanes and high wind, how to make a disaster plan. We go deeper into analog documents, but if you need to prepare your emergency or your studio for like an earthquake, we have that like very specific disaster by disaster information that you can look at. Even like snow and ice hazards, we've tried to kind of cover the range of them. So if there was something of that nature that you flagged when you're working on the risk assessment piece, we do have the tools to help you out with that and kind of looking at your studio, looking at your practice. And then I want to call out just some other resources outside of CERF Plus that are really excellent. A really general one is ready.gov, and that's the national hub on emergency preparedness. And they have resources on everything from the weather-related emergencies to preparing for issues around like even cybersecurity. And they have a pretty robust kind of suite of emergency resources, like based on different types of emergencies. And then with artists and kind of art-specific organizations, I mean, I give a shout out to CCI again. I have a copy of their Business of Art book. It's excellent. And I like how it kind of too, it gets into the financial planning, et cetera, but it also has the kind of visioning of like your practice and how you want to conduct it, and centering yourself as an artist within it. And CERF Plus contributed the chapter on insurance for Business of Art. The New York Foundation for the Arts, despite the name, the resources can extend beyond the state of New York. And they have some great financial planning tools and some resources to support you around that kind of logistic side of your practice. I talked about CERF Plus's Crafting Your Legacy book, kind of thinking around studio contents in legacy planning. That was sort of developed in conjunction to be sort of an add-on to Joan Mitchell's Foundation's call, which is Creating a Living Legacy, which supports artists in kind of documenting their artwork and practice. And if legacy planning is something you want to go deeper on, look at both our Crafting Your Legacy and Joan Mitchell's suite of resources. There's a really great kind of umbrella picture between the two of how to approach the idea of legacy planning as an artist. Creative Capital regularly has various series of workshops around everything from financial planning to kind of storytelling around like your practice as an artist. And Fractured Atlas has a really great blog series that they do. I remember one a couple months ago, helping artists kind of figure out in trying to kind of build out their professional development kind of skills and resources, how to suss out like when you should do it yourself or when it's time to call in a pro. And so keep an eye on their blog. I find it really, really helpful. And then lastly, Artists Thrive. They have this tool that they've developed that you can run through. They've developed one for both individual artists and one also for arts organizations. And the one for individual artists is this rubric to help kind of figure out, like, are you thriving as an artist, and help you pinpoint how to like move towards that if you're not. They also have a pretty robust kind of wiki site of resources on their page that run through like financial management and like marketing and branding. It's heavily a compilation, kind of helping guide you to other resources and other organizations that do that work, but it's a really robust compilation. I know Allison's going to share out these slides. I've added in links here in the PDF of these slides. So If you've taken notes, that's great. If you are really note averse or like just kind of like, I can't take any more notes, don't worry, you'll get this information. And so as we sort of start to wrap up and move towards the Q&A, I encourage you, to both think about the risk assessment and build it out more, but then kind of also think about your action plan, like kind of leaning on that foundation of risk and documentation, insurance and resources in place, and figure out what you want to take on and start thinking about when you want to do it. Think about those high priority risks that you want to start addressing and breaking them down into simple tasks. Do you want to start calling insurance providers to get quotes? Do you want to change some of the equipment or practices in your studio to make your work more safely? Do you want to start building a more robust inventory of your studio contents or other aspects of your practice? Start writing it down. And I'll note that for artists working in craft disciplines, that Get Ready grant that's launching next cycle next week can support that work. And also note that if you want to get more information about CERF Plus on a regular basis, because we also share out resources as we learn about them, there's a Get Connected page, or rather link at the bottom of every page of our website where you can sign up to get our e-communications. And so as we're learning more resources and sharing them out that might support you in this work, you can get those as we're sharing them. And so then my last tip too is, don't go it alone. Again, think about that network and that community aspect of emergency preparedness. And, who are your buddies? Like, who are the people you can be working with on this? And also, from the vantage point of, there are things you learn that you want to share out with people and kind of bring them into emergency preparedness, and then kind of working together as a group to share resources and information. You don't have to go it alone. And to that end, just keep building your plan. We're going to dive into the Q&A, but my email address is here. If you have additional information that you're looking for, or something that came up as a resource and you're wondering if something exists, you can always feel free to email me. And I'll do my best to try to get you connected, but always feel free to reach out. Again, don't feel like you have to go it alone. But from there, I just want to thank you for sticking with this. I know that was a lot of information. Again, you'll get it reiterated later on the recording and the slides. But from there, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. You can open it up for Q&A.
Okay, thank you so much, Carrie. I'm sure folks are, going to be taking in information for a little bit, but I did grab a few questions from the chat. First of all, a couple of folks were chiming in around risk assessment, and they were wondering, should that include, when they're assessing what's a risk to them individually as the artist, the asset of themselves as the artist, should they include variable income, car accidents, health, things like that? How far should they go? Do you recommend the artist go in thinking through hazardous scenarios to build out your full risk picture?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And that's where I kind of get back to that like likelihood notion, because I don't want you to feel like you have to spin out into like everything that could go wrong. But both like kind of the likelihood that something could happen, and also that notion of like how much of an impact would it have if it did. So really trying to hone in on like that intersection, like what are the points where like if the two came together, they would have like the greatest possibility to disrupt my career. Yeah, and like, yeah, again, like likelihood, because I mean, I have a really active imagination. I could think of a million things that could happen right now. Like an asteroid could fall through like my office right now and I'd be bounced off this webinar. The likelihood of that is really small. So like, that's not the piece I'm going to take on in trying to figure out like what I've got to do right now. Think about that likelihood component.
Okay, thank you. Holly asked, on the subject of insurance, does dishonest employee cover people including contract workers, interns, freelancers, etc.?
I think I'd want to hear a little more in the question, like when you say like contractors, like working for you as part of your practice, or like this is kind of people under your employ. So if it's a question more about like a contractor coming in and they've been dishonest and they do something poorly, like that would be more, they're the employee there, like that they should be covered in the policy. So it's more under, if people are under your employee for your practice, their dishonesty.
Right, because a contract worker is technically their own business, so they should have their own coverage. Yeah. Okay, great. And Holly, if you have a follow-up question, feel free to drop that into chat. Lizette was asking about the Get Ready grants that you mentioned at the top of the workshop. Can they be used to upgrade a bug out kit, like one of those emergency ready bags? She says, mine is over 4 years old from the Red Cross and needs upgrading, but it's not cheap.
Yeah. As it relates to your practice too. So if that's a key component of kind of your emergency preparedness as an artist, then yes, but that is kind of the key component is around emergency preparedness and career protection for your artistic practice. So if there's an intersection there, sure.
Great. And then as Lizette also asked about the CERF Plus website, do you have a guide about what safety features to look for when you're searching for a new co-working, or I'm going to add shared studio space in general, because a lot of, especially Bay Area artists, remember very vividly what happened in the ghost ship disaster. How do you assess a safe space before you take it on?
Yeah, and I will say actually the studio safety guide was partially ideated after Ghost Ship, and looking at those big multi-use buildings, and thinking through, okay, going forward, like how can we support artists and looking at spaces, so that they can try to avoid this situation. And so yeah, I'd say the studio safety guide, download that, because it was heavily around looking at those big multi-use spaces and thinking about, again, like the exit, like lights, the exit routes for the building, what else is happening in the building, was it meant to be used for us, like for studios? Yeah, look at the studio safety guide. I think you'll find it immensely helpful there.
Great. And Danielle was asking, and this might be a question for folks on the call to drop some answers in chat, but does anyone have any recommendations on external hardware or cloud storage products or services that are most popular for artists? Maybe this is something CERF Plus has, just like recommendations on, I guess, brands or companies. And then also insurance brokers providing or providers that work with artists. I know you have a list of some insurance providers on the Insurance Hub. Are there any other places folks should be looking for recommendations?
Yeah, and I think I totally agree with you on the hard drive question, crowdsource that one. I don't think we have specific equipment recommendations on hard drives on our site. On insurance, for other places to look besides the listings that we have, that's where I really encourage you to ask other artists who they've been using, what their experience has been. Are they happy with them? Have the insurance agents been responsive? Another one, have they ever had to file a claim? And if so, how did that go? Yeah, check in with other people is another really great source, and be sure to ask about their experience with that agent.
Great. Yeah, and I would probably add Freelancers Union is another great resource to check for different types of insurance for folks who may not be necessarily making visual art, but working as contractors or freelancers in some way. Martian's asking, again, a follow-up question about the Get Ready grants. Can they be used to cover or partially cover high quality digital camera, or just to hire a photographer to document your work? And then also, do you have a strict definition of what kind of art genres fall under the craft umbrella?
Yeah, and I'll start, before I start answering the question on whether that could work, I'm going to ask my colleague who's here to grab our definition of how we look at craft from our website and drop that into the chat, just so that everyone has it as part of the recording. So for the photographs of your work in terms of the Get Ready grant, yeah, if that's part of building your resilience moving forward, then yep, that can be used. It's interesting, before COVID, we didn't really consider that like a career protection or emergency preparedness move, but the world has changed since COVID, and moving online, things that kind of would have fallen under like the professional development umbrella before COVID, now are really part of the ongoing resilience world, and making sure that you can conduct your practice any way that you need to in the face of whatever's happening. So yeah, we do recognize that being able to maintain strong records of your photos, whether it's for online work, et cetera, is a really key career protection move, not just kind of a professional development move.
And then how many cycles per year are there of Get Ready grants?
Yeah, we typically offer 2 a year. We did pause briefly during COVID to focus on COVID relief grants, but we are back up to 2 cycles a year. So this is actually, yeah, we have one coming in March, and the dates for the next cycle are still to be determined, but they're usually in kind of early to mid fall.
And is that the one that you said opens next week?
Yeah, the one for the spring, it's opening. Actually, I'm sorry, this is already our second one this year. The years are really blurring together. I don't know about anyone
No
else in like the
kidding.
past 2 years. It's like, is it 2022? Is it 2020? But yeah, this actually the second cycle this year, and we're probably going to be able to do a third, but dates aren't for that, determined for that. But we do have a cycle opening next week on June 15th.
Great. And now we're seeing, thank you, Heather. Heather dropped in the definition of how craft discipline is defined at CERF Plus. If there's any other questions, now would be the time to drop them in the chat, or if you want to unmute and ask verbally. I also want to just take a moment to point out CCI keeps a regularly updated Google Doc of emergency resources for artists and freelancers that has included, many of which are coming to an end, but that has included COVID related emergency funds. Many of them are starting to kind of come to a close, but there are still that are potentially still open, mini grants and things like that. But then there's other types of resources and links to different mutual aid resources and housing resources and things like that. So I encourage y'all to check that out and bookmark that. Are there any other questions for Carrie? This has been a great presentation. Thank you. I'm sure, again, there's a lot for people to be sort of mulling over and chewing on. And hopefully, as you said, wonderful suggestion to be working in pairs, maybe working with friends or colleagues on putting together your plan. See, we have one raised hand. If you're able to unmute, go ahead and ask your question. While we're waiting to see if that person is able to unmute, I'm also going to drop into chat a link to a workshop evaluation. We really appreciate your feedback. So if you're about to log off, please open that first and give us your feedback. Yes, person, you have a question?
Yes, hello?
Hi, we can hear you.
Yes, I need to know if you feel that there should be any need for disability insurance for performers or visual artists.
So for yourself, I'm curious just to hear you say a little more about the context of your question.
I'm currently disabled, but I came from another career and into art, first as art therapy and now as a career. And I know that chronic lower back pain, arthritis, joint issues can be an issue for performers and for artists, including other issues, mental health issues, chemical exposures. You know, my previous experience was as a physician. So just on that, and then now you're thinking of something sweeping as like a pandemic, and how much of this is a risk for the artist, creative performer groups.
Yeah, I think I get the gist of your question. I apologize if I misinterpret it. I hear that as looking for the kind of the what if insurance kind of based on like physical impacts, based on your practice, et cetera. Yeah, I kind of go back to that. If that's feeling, and you're thinking about what you're doing, like the biggest vulnerability for you, then yeah, looking into that. Let me see if we have any kind of information on that. I'll just acknowledge it's a topic I'm not super conversant in. But let me see if I can quickly find any information to kind of help you out with that, because I'd love to be able to point you in the direction of something that could be useful, since it's not something I can kind of, I have a really super like expert level answer on. So let me kind of quickly look.
The link that I shared also to CCI's emergency resources too. There's different types of resources for the entertainment community, dramatists guild, musicians. There's different organizations that might have more resources specifically for your practice, depending on what type of performing arts practice you are engaged in. So you might want to check that out. I think I linked to that above.
And actually, that's a great idea. And Allison, I didn't, I got distracted while I was looking, but the Actors Fund. Yep. Okay.
Yes, and the Actors Fund is now known as the Entertainment Community Fund.
Yeah.
So you'll find them certainly in our emergency resources document. Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, I think they'd be the go-to on that.
Yeah, it's a great option. Yeah. Here, I'll drop that link in the chat. Oh, thank you, Heather. It's already on it. Great. This is a more specific link. Am I eligible for help? They offer all different kinds of help and support. Yeah, for medical emergencies and things. All right, well, that's pretty much our time. Oh, just out of curiosity, Martian asked, what's the plus stand for in CERF's name?
There's our founding mission, that Craft Emergency Relief Fund, and that was our name for a long time. It's just CERF, the Craft Emergency Relief Fund. And that plus is the recognition that we have folded in this equal weight on emergency preparedness and see that as just as vital as after the emergency happens.
Awesome. Well, that's good. Solves up that mystery for us. Well, thank you so much. I just want to remind everybody this recording will go on CCI's YouTube channel. When you registered, you would have received a link to that. I'll drop this again in the chat. So be sure to follow that channel if you're curious. You can also always check out cciarts.org for archived recordings such as this one. Please follow CCI and CERF Plus on your favorite social media channels. Sign up for our newsletters, and we thank you so much for joining us today. And we thank you so much for your questions. And it was lovely to have everybody with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Allison. Everyone. Thank you all.